This happened a few years ago, but it still gives me an unsettling feeling whenever I think about it. The only reason I'm talking about it now is because I feel like it's been long enough since it happened and I won't risk anything by putting it on the internet. Back then, my wife and I had just moved into the suburbs from the city. We'd just had our third kid, and between the baby stuff, the toys, and the general chaos, our apartment felt way too cramped. We found a nice house in a quiet, safe neighborhood. The neighbors described it as the kind of place where you'd feel fine leaving the doors unlocked. The house itself wasn't massive, but it was definitely a step up from the tiny space we'd previously been living in. One of the features that caught my wife's eye was the backyard. It had this beautiful, slightly overgrown garden with a few old statues scattered around. They were weathered, a little eerie looking, like something out of Game of Thrones. I know it sounds weird, but my wife and I loved it. Said it gave our yard character. I was pretty indifferent, so I left everything as it was, statues and all. I figured it was less work for me, which I was never going to complain about. A few days after we moved in, I was looking out the window, taking in the yard, when I noticed something odd. One of the statues, an angel I think, was facing away from the house. All the others were facing toward us, so it looked strange. I could have sworn they all faced the same direction, but I didn't really know for sure. I didn't think much of it, and just assumed I was misremembering things. The next morning, I looked out the window again, and that's when I noticed it. Another statue had turned around, again facing away from the house. This time I knew something was up. I had never been more sure about anything in my life. I asked my wife about it, but she just shrugged it off and said she hadn't noticed anything. I thought maybe it was my son Jimmy. He was a little prankster back then, always up to something. But when I asked him, he just looked at me like I was nuts. I doubted he'd do something like that anyway. I knew something was going on though, but I couldn't prove it. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I tried to ignore it. Besides, I had bigger problems to worry about. I don't like admitting it, but money was really tight during that time, and I lived in perpetual fear that I was going to lose my job. A few days went by without anything strange, and I started to relax. But then one evening, I looked out the window, and my heart nearly stopped. All of the statues were lined up in a row at the very edge of the house, just standing there. It was a freakish sight, like something out of a horror movie. I know it sounds ridiculous, but part of me could feel all those eyes looking at me. My breathing went shallow. I couldn't decide whether it was more scary or bizarre. I went outside to get a closer look, trying to make sense of it. Before opening up the back door, I took a few nervous glances around the yard to make sure there was no one out there. It was daylight, but I was paranoid. Eventually, I worked up the courage to open the door and go inspect the statues. I went to lift one of them and immediately realized something. Those statues were heavy, way too heavy for one person to move alone. I couldn't even budge one of them on my own. As I was debating what to do, my wife came outside, and the look on her face told me she was just as freaked out as I was. She suggested maybe some of the other neighbors were messing with us, trying to scare the new people on the block, but that explanation literally made no sense. We had met all of the neighbors, and they all seemed like fairly normal people. Plus, I had trouble believing that anyone sane would do this to a family with young children. This was harassment, not some harmless prank. We ended up calling the police, but as you might expect, they couldn't do much. They suggested putting up some security cameras, but we didn't have the money for that. I told the cops we would, but on the inside, I was really reluctant to do something so drastic. They left, and I guess I felt a little better, even though my wife was still extremely shaken up. My wife and I did everything we could to hide the situation from our kids. Say what you will, but we didn't want to scare them. Nothing happened the next day, or the next. I speculated that the cops had scared whoever was there away, which did track on many levels. So we tried to forget about it, even though neither of us really felt comfortable. I tried to assure myself that maybe my wife was right. Maybe it had just been a prank or something. That didn't do anything to calm my nerves though. I was on edge, looking out the windows every time I passed by, half expecting to see the statue somewhere else. I hope no one ever has to experience the sensation of feeling unsafe in your own home. A few days passed without incident. I started thinking the nightmare was over, and for the first time in a while, the house was actually starting to feel like home. I could not have been more wrong. It was a weekend. I don't remember whether it was Saturday or Sunday, but it was definitely a weekend since my kids didn't have school. After some breakfast, I went outside to play in the yard with my kids, and that's when I saw it. Spray painted in big black letters on the back wall of our house were the words "Go away." I nearly dropped my son when I saw it. Without thinking, I rushed my kids inside and told my wife to stay in the house with them. I don't know what came over me. I'm not that brave of a guy, but I started sprinting through the garden, screaming threats at whoever had vandalized my house. Adrenaline was coursing through my veins, and I was looking for a fight. No one was anywhere in my yard, though. Eventually, I gave up looking. As I was walking back towards the house, the adrenaline in me turned to outright fear. This was serious. Someone had left a direct message meant to scare us. They could have meant us harm, and I knew the situation was only going to escalate from there. The police came again and took down another report, but without any leads, there wasn't much they could do. I insisted that they stay on the property in case those people came back, but they told me they didn't have enough evidence to waste resources like that. As far as they knew, some teenage delinquents could have been behind the graffiti. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They told me they'd make sure a patrol officer was nearby, which I guess was some kind of consolation. My wife was twice as upset as I was, so I reassured her that we'd be okay, even though I was freaking out internally. That night, I was in the kitchen when I heard my wife scream from the living room. I ran in, and she was standing by the window pointing outside. I looked, and my stomach dropped. There were 5 people standing in our backyard, each of them wearing white face coverings. They were dancing around in this strange, jerky way, almost like puppets. We just stood there, watching them, too shocked to move. It was terrifying. I don't know what they were trying to accomplish, but it was the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen. I snapped out of my haze and grabbed the biggest kitchen knife we had. I basically screamed at my wife to call the police, and while she was doing that, I ran out the back door with a knife in my hand. I screamed like a clinically insane person and took one step toward them before instantly regretting it. There were 5 of them and 1 of me. They could have been armed. Before anything else could happen, I turned and ran back inside the house like a coward. The knife must have scared them though, because they stopped dancing and ran into the garden, out of sight. I told my wife to run upstairs, find the kids, and hide, and I guarded the back door in case they tried to break in. By the time the police arrived, those people were gone. The police did a thorough search but couldn't find any trace of them. That was the last straw. I didn't care about the costs. I bought and installed security cameras the next day. My wife was hysterical for weeks after that, begging me to let us move somewhere else. I told her that if one more thing happens, that we would, but that we'd probably be screwing ourselves financially if it came to that. Luckily, the cameras must have done the trick, because those people never returned, and we never had another incident occur on the property. The scariest thing, though, is that we still live in this same house, and never got an explanation for what happened. My wife Taylor and I recently moved out of our old home. She didn't like being so close to her family and wanted to put some distance between us and them, so that's what we did. We don't have kids, and she stopped working ages ago, so she was relatively amenable to my suggestions about where to move. I'm an electrician, so bouncing around isn't much of a problem for me. We eventually settled on New Mexico. We've both been rural people all our lives, so it wasn't that siblings and 2 dogs. The house was loud, always buzzing with life. But this was quiet. Really quiet. That was honestly the hardest part about the transition. The lack of noise. Living alone felt strange, and at first, I wasn't sure I'd ever get used to it. I'm sure anyone who's gone from living with family to living alone knows what I'm talking about. One thing I loved about the house was the tiny balcony on the 2nd floor. Don't get the wrong impression. I don't even know if I can really even call it a balcony. It was barely big enough to stand on, and I couldn't even fit a chair out there. Regardless, I go out there most nights after work to take a break and clear my head. I smoked pretty often, but I hated the smell, so smoking inside wasn't an option for me. The balcony was twice as beneficial for that exact reason. I didn't even have to go outside or leave the comfort of my own home just to smoke. It felt like a luxury. I'll describe the layout of the property so what I'm about to tell you makes sense. The block I lived on was pretty standard, with houses adjacent to each other all the way down. The street behind mine was exactly the same, meaning everyone's house would be sharing a backyard if it weren't for the 10-foot tall fences designating the property lines. From my balcony, I could see over my backyard neighbor's fence and into his yard. You could see the whole place, really. After a few weeks, I realized I'd met almost all the neighbors except him. Come to think of it, I don't think I had ever seen him, let alone have a conversation with him. The guy never waved and never came over. I never saw him in the yard or at the bedroom window. Nothing. It was like he didn't exist. If it weren't for the occasional bedroom light on at night, I would have assumed the place was deserted. I guessed that there was an old person living there since the grass looked like it hadn't been cut in years, and I never heard any sounds from their yard. After another week, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to go introduce myself and at least put a face to the name. One Saturday, I walked around the block to his place, expecting to knock on the door and maybe make some small talk. But the house looked rough. Rough was an understatement. It looked completely untouched. The yard was a mess, overgrown with weeds, and the whole place looked like it had been ignored for years. The paint was chipping, some of the siding had been scratched off, and the walkway was stained. The doorbell was broken, so I gave a few loud knocks and waited. Nothing. I felt awkward standing there and started to wonder if maybe the place really was vacant. But then I saw a slight movement behind the window shade. Just a flicker, like someone was peeking out. That was enough for me. Someone was in there, spying on me, but wouldn't open the door for some reason. I turned to leave, when all of a sudden, the door flew open, slamming against the wall like someone had ripped it open in a violent rage. I jumped back, totally thrown off. I whipped around and found myself face to face with an elderly Asian woman standing in the doorway, staring at me. She was short, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her skin was wrinkled, but somehow tense, like she was flexing her face muscles, if that even makes sense. Her eyes were wide, unsettlingly wide. I can't even lie, I was pretty freaked out just looking at her. There was something off about her, like it looked like she was on something. She didn't say a word, just stared with no expression on her face. Eventually, I cleared my throat and introduced myself as her new neighbor. After a few seconds, she said her name was Priscilla and gave me a half smile, and that was it. She didn't even ask my name, she just stood there watching me. I nodded and turned away, not knowing what to say. I left feeling more unnerved than I wanted to admit. I never heard the door close behind me, but I didn't want to turn around and get caught looking. Later that night, I went out to my balcony like usual, trying to forget about the strange interaction. At that point, I had no idea of the ordeal that I had just gotten myself into. When I glanced over the railing, there she was, that crazy-looking lady from earlier, standing dead center in her yard, looking straight up at my house. She didn't move, didn't call out, just stood there staring. It was one of those moments where you wonder if you're actually seeing what you think you're seeing. I didn't know if I should say something, wave, or pretend like I hadn't noticed her. It was one of the freakiest things I'd ever seen, and I didn't know how to handle it. I went back inside and told myself she was just a little messed up in the head, and that I shouldn't be getting worked up over a harmless old lady. But it didn't stop there. The following night, I saw her again, but this time, she was moving from one window to another inside her house, watching me from each one. Although I pretended not to notice her, part of me felt like she knew that I knew she was watching. I was hoping she'd stop, but she didn't. She was still looking at me when I finished smoking and turned to go inside. Out of curiosity, I peeked out one of my windows about 20 minutes later to see if she was still looking at my house. To my horror, she actually was. I called my dad, and he told me that she probably had dementia or something, and that she was most likely just lonely or confused. He told me that I should actually feel bad for her. It was kind of hard to feel bad for someone who was borderline stalking me, but my dad calmed my nerves and assured me that she was harmless. A few nights passed without anything weird happening. I didn't see her in her yard or at any of her windows. I thought maybe my dad had been right, and was starting to feel glad that I hadn't done something drastic. That is, until one morning, when I found a woman's sock on my side of the fence, just sitting in my yard. I stared at it, feeling a chill run through me. This wasn't just her strange behavior anymore. She'd been on my property. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to confront her, but I was starting to feel like I couldn't ignore it either. I should have called the police right there, but I didn't because I didn't want to create issues with a neighbor. That night, as I was laying in bed, the doorbell started ringing. Not once, not twice, at least a dozen times, one right after the other. I didn't even need to look. I knew it was her. In my tired haze, I wasn't thinking clearly. I was more annoyed than scared. I got up, threw on a shirt, and went to the door, telling myself I'd just ask her to leave me alone. I told myself that I'd been putting this off for long enough, and it was about time I dealt with it. I have no idea why I wasn't scared in that moment. I still look back and cringe at how flippantly I handled the situation. I don't even want to say I was naive, but I can't think of a better word to describe my attitude to it all. The second I opened the door, she lunged at me. She ran full speed at me with a kitchen knife in her hand, her face twisted in rage. She started screaming, yelling something about how I had taken her son from her. I barely had time to process what was happening. I grabbed her arm, managing to wrestle the knife out of her grip, and I pinned her down on the floor. She was easy to overpower, but that didn't make the situation any less terrifying. My heart was racing and my hands were shaking as I held her there and called the police. She was still screaming nonsense about her son and told me that she was going to kill me. At one point she tried to bite me, but I wasn't going to let her go until the police arrived. It was the longest 5 minutes of my life. She never stopped screaming or squirming the entire time. When the police finally arrived, they restrained her and forced her into one of their cruisers. She screamed the whole time, and I could still hear her screaming even after they shoved her in the car. I had never been more scared in my life. The police made sure I was okay and told me she'd be sent to some kind of psychiatric facility. I never saw her again after that. This incident still weighs pretty heavily on my mind and has definitely made me a more paranoid and cautious person. I ended up moving out not even a year later.